Welcome to Show Studio. We're now into the swing of the couture shows, but it's kind of a really big one to analyse. It's the Dior Couture show, and it's one that I think kind of sets the pace of what's happening in couture and what modern couture really means. Dior's a really interesting house at the moment as well, because it throws up a lot of other topics, things to do with modernisation, things to do with the pace of fashion, topics that we're going to discuss, particularly related to the fashion calendar and sort of the pace of shows. I think Dior, alongside other houses, perhaps Chanel and Louis Vuitton, are really sort of setting the pace for what it means to be a modern house in terms of sort of your scheduling, your relationship with the press, the big seasonal sort of drops that you're doing in store. But before we delve into all that discussion and talk obviously about the amazing couture pieces that Mr. Simmons will have created there, I'll let my wonderful set of panellists, who are from all across the industry, which is what I really like about these panels, introduce themselves, starting with you, Paula.
My name is Paula Reid. I am creative consultant at myteresa.com and also at Mondadori in Italy.
My name is Hettie Judah. I'm a writer and editor, and I specialise in fashion, art and design.
I'm Alison Moloney. I'm a curator at the London College of Fashion.
I'm Amy Haye. I'm a dress historian and curator and professor at London College of Fashion.
We've really done curator corner, haven't we? Yes, you're like travelling packs. As I said at the start, one of the things that I want to kick off the discussion about is about sort of the pace and scheduling of shows. And I think it does kind of relate to the couture, because a topic that's always comes up on these panels is how the couture shows in themselves are kind of a branding exercise, and there's so much about these huge kind of theatrical presentations that are about building kind of brand awareness. And I think that notion is something that has really sort of had a big impact on these new shows that we're seeing, which are the resort and the cruise presentations, which have really kind of, I guess in terms of aesthetic and presentation, married the couture with the ready-to-wear, because the clothing we're seeing is very practical. It's great for sales, it's great for the stores, but this presentation is much more along the lines of a couture show, very elaborate, very one-off. We're seeing crazy things, guests sort of flown all over the world to kind of report on these shows. Is this sustainable, these kind of crazy shows we're seeing all over the world? And also, is it ethical that we're seeing journalists flown to a location? Like, I found some facts on it. It was like the Dior show that they did, that was in New York. I think they flew 900 guests out. And the Chanel cruise presentation that was in Dubai, they flew 1,000 guests. And what's our take on it? There's a lot of big questions in there.
There's a lot of big questions.
Sorry. So tell me, what's the future of fashion, guys? But I'm interested in that calendar and also just that notion of, it ties into themes of fashion criticism. There's lots of things to talk about. What do we all think?
15 years ago, China, Russia, Korea, all of these places that are now vitally important to a luxury fashion house's business were nascent markets. I mean, they really were not important. They may have had incredible potential, but they were literally coming on stream in terms of a kind of profit center. Now they are massive. It's where all of the fashion houses are doing most of their growth and seeing the potential for growth. Even though China's had a bit of a hiccup and kind of leveled out recently, it is all about the emerging, not just the kind of luxury class, but now the people following behind the emerging middle classes who are coming online, providing enormous potential, not just for bricks and mortar, but for e-commerce as well. So that's why I think you're seeing a lot of these houses traveling to their market and setting themselves up with this incredible fanfare and these really impressive presentations, which I've been lucky enough to kind of attend once or twice. And I used to think that I had seen most of what was impressive until I went to a Chanel presentation in Tokyo and I realised I hadn't been born.
So do you think that is the kind of main impetus behind it, is to kind of, I guess, tip their cap, for want of a better phrase, to these new markets and to show that it's not just about the kind of the full fashion cities?
Yeah, and also the kind of emerged world, if you like. So there's really mature markets like Europe and America, they were totally flat. I mean, still important markets, of course, but mature with no room for expansion, fully exploited, I guess, if you like. We all know about it. We know all the kind of brand codes inside out. We're fully familiar. Our teenagers are, all generations are. So what are they going to do? Of course, they're going to go and make friends with these people who are suddenly really hungry for what it is that they've got to offer and fascinated by it and really want to have it. So it makes big commercial sense, of course.
What's your take on it, Hettie?
I'm very much. I think it's as Paula was saying, it's a real kind of show of, I guess, a show of respect for these new audiences. And the companies that aren't doing full-fledged fashion shows are definitely, for example, doing, Lanvin does trunk shows in Dubai.
Yeah, of course.
They'll be doing some form of show in the new markets as well. I think the issue of doing that many collections a year is an ethical issue. And the fact that we would talk about fast fashion, we think of fast fashion as kind of Primark and whatever. But now high fashion is also becoming fast fashion.
Yeah, of course.
And so it's, there is this kind of unpleasant feeling that you're constantly, being asked to renew things. And also the people who are designing these things, the burnout is getting worse and worse. I remember when Burberry first started doing 4 collections a year, I had a couple of friends who just left after a couple of years because it just suddenly became constant demand, and you just get exhausted. You can't come up with amazing ideas all the time.
I think it's interesting to think also about those 4 collections and how we talk about resort and cruise almost like they're the add-on collections, but actually commercially, in a way, they're more significant than the spring, summer and the autumn, winter. And I think you're really seeing that pressure on young designers. They feel like if they can't deliver something for that season, then perhaps they're not going to sort of achieve as big a buy as they would need to kind of keep their business going. And that's it's just the whole fashion system feels like a little bit out of step, doesn't it?
I can't think of a designer now who doesn't do a pre-collection or a resort collection. This resort thing and a cruise is the weirdest word in the world. I get so confused about it.
I know, it's so confusing.
And everybody hates it. They're all pre-collections. Basically, people are showing spring, summer, autumn and winter. That's the way I like to think about it now. And it is, because when resort drops in November, it's quite wintry and also kind of festive, so it's kind of ready for Christmas. It used to be that it was only for the American market, and it was because a significant and very wealthy cohort of that very wealthy market flew to California or Florida or wherever it was, Palm Beach, where they liked to overwinter, or the Bahamas or whatever, and the Caribbean. But now it's a collection that drops. Everybody wants newness. Everybody wants newness.
I think I think you wrote a very interesting piece about the death of kind of actual trends in fashion, didn't you? Well,
potentially. It sounds like the kind of thing.
I'm pretty sure
read
you
a
did
lot
it
of
on
pieces.
I think you did it in Business of Fashion. I think it connects into that as well. This kind of weird thing. There aren't like major trends anymore, oddly enough. And
Which
there's
is
this kind of
about
like
newness.
sub-trends. So there'll be the ripped knees, and there'll be a couple of identifiable things. But it's not like this is where the hemlines are, and this is where the shoulders are. It's quite odd because it's now happening so fast. There's almost not time for big overarching.
Well, I found this amazing quote from Sydney, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Toledano, who's obviously chief executive of Dior. Got there, should have just said that's who he is. And it was the amazing quote was, "The customer wants it, and the giant Dior cruise show, wherever it is next year, is here to stay. The customer is demanding it. People want more fashion, they want more newness." And it's so do you know what I mean? It's kind of like...
It's the thing that gets the biggest response on the website at myteresa.com is new arrivals.
New arrivals.
Well, there are 2 things, clearly, that get a lot of interest. Sale is one of them, because I guess everybody loves a bargain. And new arrivals is the next one. We literally have a spike in traffic at whatever time new arrivals goes up. So if that's kind of midnight in England or 5 o'clock in the morning in Dubai, bang. Literally, it's like people are poised at their computers waiting for that to happen. So that's an unavoidable fact of the market. But at the same time, there was a really interesting BFC fashion forum the other day and last week, and one of the topics of conversation was sustainability in fashion. And Livia Firth was there because her movie, The Uncomfortable Truth, was being released on Friday, and also a super interesting guy whose name I've completely forgotten, but he is the CEO of Sustainability and Caring, and they gave a really interesting panel talk about the issues that surround manufacture, sourcing, raw materials, employment, all of that. They're becoming much bigger issues now, and they were saying that particularly the Caring guy was that they had identified that these were aspects of their marketing campaigns that, okay, so maybe they would be gathering a pace now among our generation, but they certainly see it as the next generation as a key buying decision, or a key factor behind the buying decision as the sustainability. So I don't think it's a coincidence that it's on our minds, it's on everybody's mind.
On that note, in terms of you talking about it's no longer about the 4 fashion cities, but it still is, but they're just going around the world and taking their product around the world. And I was thinking about why they're flying out all of these international journalists from these cities as well. It's just so bizarre when all in the same city. And I wonder what's going to happen in terms of the flourishing design education in China and Korea and these parts of the world, and also with the bloggers that are emerging and the journalists that are emerging there. Do you think I don't know if they're sending out journalists because, you know, audiences in China are still looking to journalists from the West, or whether
I think it's just this weird thing, isn't it? Well, I always think fashion is so forward-thinking in some ways, but so conservative in others, and you notice it. Like, I notice it sometimes when you do work with big PR companies where they are still obsessed with getting their feature in Vogue or their feature in the traditional print magazine, and there's not that. I don't think people are really embracing kind of the new voices. So I think, you know, for a show to be deemed a success, it is like a checklist. They'd want those reviews in those big kind of Western newspapers, and it's deemed important still. And I think it's just that weird kind of balance between forward thinking and conservative.
But then some of them really are the voices of authority. I mean, if I was putting, you know, €1 million into a fashion show, I would really want the opinion of Susie Menkes or Cathy Horn or Lisa Armstrong. That would matter to me.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, a blogger with, 80,000 followers is significant as well, but I would want the fashion experts.
It's a different sort of significance though as well, isn't it?
It's a different significance.
The bloggers are going to perhaps enhance sales, but there's a gravitas if Susie Menkes says something.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And tell us a bit, just, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm interested in kind of the way throughout history designers have managed to kind of target those key areas that they're consuming, like the lifestyle of their consumers, so things like the fact their consumer might travel. Have we always kind of seen a resort, but it just wasn't branded and marketed in the same way? Or is that quite a new thing? I guess maybe it was just called kind of bespoke before and you just went with a specific need.
Well, historically, I mean, sort of the first haute couture house, or one of the first, was Worth, and they did 2 seasonal collections a year. But it would have embraced everything you needed. So if you perhaps, you know, whatever you would have ordered, your sportswear, your tailoring, your evening gowns, you'd have ordered everything. But they didn't do mid-seasons. And I don't know for sure, but I was thinking about it this morning, and I just wonder if it was someone like Chanel who really sort of promoted that whole sort of resort, the aesthetic of resort and suntans, and I just wondered if she didn't do mid-collections or resort collections, but whether that was the beginning of it. Because it was for rich people who lived in colder climates, wasn't it, going somewhere hotter now? And because also with global warming, I mean, even in this country, you know, the demand, for instance, for heavyweight winter coats has gone right down, hasn't it? Everyone wants lightweight fibres, and so the clothes we wear are less distinctive from season to season.
You almost think with fashion being so global, I don't know if it's even sustainable to still show it in a seasonal way. I know that sounds quite like nuts, but it just doesn't actually make any sense when you think about it, particularly given that it's shown through most clothes are bought kind of through online retail, where you are selling to some Matches Fashion sells to it's like 192 countries or something, and you think those seasons just mean nothing, like that sense of when you travel and what you do and what the weather is like. But I don't know how we're going to get to a point where people break out from that calendar, or whether that is something that would even be possible.
I don't think the calendar really even matters so much anymore. I mean, they have these kind of old-fashioned, outmoded names, but they are almost completely irrelevant. I mean, I interviewed Stella McCartney not so long ago, and she was choking over the word resort. Said, "Oh, I wish it wasn't called this, but you know, we all use it because that's the reference that we understand what we're talking about when we use that word. But actually, it is utterly irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference, and it is literally more like spring, summer, autumn, winter. So that when you get those kind of 4 drops every year, that it's refreshing your entire selection." And that's what's more important, is that newness, because people
they should almost just call it 1, 2, 3, 4.
Almost, you could. Yeah.
I think if you're a designer and you know that you've got people buying your collection in Singapore who are going to be in kind of 40-degree heat in December, you're going to incorporate elements into the collection that are going to be attractive to that audience. So it may still be called winter or autumn or whatever, but it's going to include elements that you can wear in a different climate. I think any savvy designer would do that, and I think it may not necessarily be on the catwalk.
But then why do we still have that strange 6-month lag? I think that's part of the problem. If you're showing it and then you can't buy it for 6 months, it just feels really
because it has to be made.
Yeah, but I think there must be a way because I spoke to Henry Holland about this, because he started doing his menswear, obviously, which is available to buy straight away, which is a lot of brands are toying with, like Burberry kind of do it, but kind of half, it's only on some key accessories, and a lot of it is pre-order. But Moschino now you can buy straight away. And Henry Holland was saying he really wants to do it with his women's wear, but he was like, you just can't. He can't find a way. You'd either have to like sit out a season, and you'd be out of step with everyone else. You'd be trying to get people to buy stuff before it's had any press, but it doesn't feel like a sustainable way.
It's a massive gamble. That's a massive gamble for a designer, because they have to put all of their money behind their own stock and decide what is going to sell. So I mean, you'd have to be pretty well established and well financed.
And in terms of sizing, and I mean the whole point about haute couture, isn't it, is that you go and the garment fits your unique body, and you can't predetermine that. You can't.
But also the seasons as well. It's all about the marketing and the campaigns that go behind it as well.
But do you not think the consumers are confused? If I was a shopper and I saw something I wanted, I'd just want it. I think we all know fashion so well, so I know that I'll see it and I'll love it and I'll wait for it to be shot, and then I'll save up for it and probably never be able to afford to buy it. But like, I think as a shopper, if they see a show, and like, if you think the fashion press are all going to these big shows and they're putting them all on Instagram and be like, look at this, it's amazing, and that's got such a reach, but then the shopper will be like, oh, but I can't buy it, I don't understand. I just feel like there's some kind of disconnect there.
I almost wonder if it makes it more precious, because you can go onto Oxford Street and buy anything just now, and actually it's a really considered decision, and it's precious, and you go and have fittings. And I mean, certainly with a designer like Raf Simons, who says, well, it's about wanting to evoke a certain sort of emotion. Would you invest in emotional something, don't you, if you order one or two special garments and you go and you're fitted and you wait for them, and
even if you're not fitted, I mean, even if you're just going to buy something that's off the catwalk, why should you have it immediately? I mean, whoever said we can have it like that? It's not popcorn. I mean, some things just take a lot of time to be made, and they are rare, and they take a lot of expertise, and they don't happen overnight. And I think it's really a bit twisted for people to think, I see it, I want it now. I mean,
and is it unique to fashion? I wonder, would we think about that with other media?
Or with a car.
I
ordered a chair 4 months ago. I think I should have had it last month, but I haven't got it yet.
You're like, need to make a call.
I'm not hanging by a thread. I'm looking forward to having it. But what is this thing with fashion that you're supposed to
But I think it's the disconnect between the pace, and I totally agree with you, and I completely agree with what you were saying. I mean, I think that notion, particularly with the couture for waiting, makes complete sense. But I think if the whole industry is getting more and more set up on speed, and we're all saying all choppers want is newness, but we're also saying they have to wait. That's what, if we were still showing in this 2 seasons way, very slow, I'd think 6 months makes sense. But I think it's out of step with the whole way the industry is setting itself up. I think that's what I find confusing.
I can see. You say.
Well, the drip feed of the newness that keeps the shopper still interested. And if it was there just like that, then you wouldn't see these.
I mean, a lot of these. So last summer? I can't remember. I get really confused about the time as well. When Jonathan Anderson's first collection for Loewe, for example, went straight into Colette. So the show happened, and then there was a capsule of that collection went straight into the window of Colette. And they had a project. I think they had 4 designers that went straight online. And as you say, Burberry do a similar thing, and Moschino were doing something. It's not the full collection though. That's another kind of marketing woohoo. It's not that easy to get. I mean, it's still quite special.
I guess it's also different if you have your own stores, or if you're depending on people like Paula going around going, I love that one, I'm going to take 5,000. I'm going to completely ignore that. I love that one, I'm going to take 5. Because if you have your own stores, and if you're Burberry and you generally sell most of your stock out of your own stores, then you can be confident that you know what you want to stock.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if you're depending on Paula to choose, then you have to wait until they place their order.
Which is that worry of the dumbing down of the stuff that's buy it now, because the brands who do it, and it's really smart what you just said about the capsule that they did with Colette, the brands who are starting to do buy it straight away, it tends to be a very obvious buy. It's things like logo t-shirts and sweatshirts, and because obviously they don't want to push something through that they don't know if it'll sell if it's like, so it is that kind of dumbing down of fashion, which is worrying. I think the last thing, we did touch on it, is that notion though of flying. I just find it strange, that idea of flying press somewhere and expecting them to report on it. I just don't see how that can ever be. I think it's very different flying your buyer And I think, but there's flying a critic to your show and putting them up in a hotel.
But it doesn't exist unless it's been seen.
Yeah.
Especially in this Instagram.
Yeah, and it's
world,
never the same
isn't.
as seeing it on the screen as seeing the real thing, is it?
But I just think, how can journalists review things honestly if that's the kind of, because it feels like the big houses have managed to kind of buy that coverage.
That's
in a
another
sense.
question altogether.
It's also a massive carbon imprint, isn't it? So if people are arguing against it on on the basis of sustainability, it's not only the make of the clothes, it's the spin-offs.
Yeah.
But then also for sort of emerging economies, all those hotels, it's bringing a lot of revenue in, isn't it? In terms of their industry,
Yeah,
the broader industries as well.
It makes so much money, absolutely.
And I guess you're telling those other locations that you're taking them seriously because you're making sure the press are there. And I guess in a few years' time, when maybe they have a more established set of critics that are maybe there on the ground, then it becomes less important to fly city makers halfway around the world.
But I find it really ironic that you're flying a journalist over to see a Dior collection in Korea rather than the local designers' collections. So I think it's this idea of respecting the sort of local audience is a little bit ambiguous.
I think that we had that at the menswear. I wrote quite a lot about it in some of my reviews. It was the weirdest season in the menswear because everything, like, it almost became like a joke. Like, every press release I got, I was like trying to tick it off. They all started like East meets West, or like looking to the Orient. Every single one, they were like the idea of a global traveller, like everyone. And it was kind of this weird, some of them, it was obviously just a way of kind of like nodding their head to those new markets, and actually the collection was just kind of business as usual. That was kind of its most tasteful. At its worst, it was like real kind of parody, like embarrassing, kind of like old, kind of like red tassels and dragons, and like there's a Dolce collection that was really kind of like super oriental. I just thought, who is this for? Because I don't think, it was just very, very weird season. And that is, I think, part of the problem is when fashion tries to kind of nod to emerging markets, often it's such a kind of a Western view, and I think that's kind of quite embarrassing sometimes, and it's how you get that balance right between actually kind of genuinely supporting and nurturing. Because what's a bit sad about some of these presentations is you think, oh, it's in Tokyo, or oh, it's in Dubai, but it could have happened anywhere. Like, it's the same journalist, it's the same clothes, it's the same aesthetic, it's the same front row, and it's almost like they've just plonked it. It's really strange, but there's no general sense of that culture.
Although when I went, I did Shanghai, one of those trips, Beijing and Tokyo. And my memory of it was that, of course, there was a kind of cohort of the Western press, and the big fromages were there. But the audience was full of local people, full. So it was their kind of A-list, and and everyone came out and it really felt like there was a massive sense of occasion. Whereas, in Europe or America, sometimes you do get that sense of, the audience kind of checking their watches when the designer's taken his bow on the show, because they're wondering, oh, am I going to make it to my dinner reservation? We get a little bit jaded and a little bit over it. But there, in all of those locations, it felt like, wow, this was something really special happening. And it was quite contagious. And I think most journalists are by nature really, really curious people, and I was never on one of those trips when we didn't bolt on as much research in the local area, because there's no way the print media has got the kind of budget to fly somebody to look at Shanghai or check out what's going on in Beijing. So a lot of people were working really hard around the event to find out what was going on in that market.
So I also think you're probably really right. We say, oh, it's the same people, it's the same front row. But we also have to bear in mind the subsequent reportage of it. And it's like, we're not going to see pictures of all the local celebs in our news coverage, because I found it really interesting with the Met Ball, how everyone was saying, oh, all the focus was on kind of like, Rihanna or whoever, and actually if you looked at the Chinese press, it wasn't. It was all about the Chinese actresses who were there and looked incredible, but they weren't in our coverage, and it created this weird, like, kind of skewed view of that event, and that's quite interesting, is how it kind of is reported as well. I feel like there's so much to talk about on this, but one thing I want to talk about before we go to the show is with completely different tack. It's the rise of the fashion documentary, because you kind of can't really talk about Dior at the moment without talking about Dior and I, which was, I don't know if everyone's seen it, but it was the most incredible film. It was Frederick Chang who did it, who worked on the Valentino film and the Diana Vreeland, I Has to Travel, and he's really amazing. We actually interviewed him. There's a really great interview on the site with him. And I thought it was a really, really fascinating kind of insight. And I think a lot of people were surprised to get that much kind of, I guess, insider view of Raf Simons and his creative process. And it didn't feel too PR-y, I thought. When you watched it, it didn't feel like Dior had kind of watched every scene and edited it. You saw some kind of difficult moments. And now when I said I wanted to discuss the topic, I thought it was quite a new thing, the rise of the fashion documentary. But Amy, you kind of were immediately like, you said, this is something that's happened for a while. Houses have been very clever about revealing their creative process.
Yeah, historically they just did it in very different ways. So, I mean, designers in like the 1910s and 20s used to have newsreels. So you'd go to the cinema and you'd see a newsreel of a fashion show. So I mean, they got really good mass exposure then, and it really completely disseminated their designs. But also they were savvy sort of text-wise, and I just brought these books that I just happened to have, by Dior. But, one's Little Dictionary of Fashion, Christiane Dior talking about fashion, Dior by Dior. And these books were hugely, hugely popular. They were translated into multiple languages. There are multiple prints, sort of publications. And so these reached a mass circulation, and people were really, really interested to know about the man, but also to know about what his aesthetic was. And if you can't buy Dior, you read it and it says Dior says, there's like the tips.
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a similar kind of set of themes that it covers. It's like the man, the person, the designer, the process. That's interesting.
But also totally valuing the artisanal side of it. And that's, it's sort of linking on from what we have been talking about, is a film like that. It makes you realise it really is a craft process, and it's multiple crafts. It involves so many really skilled people, and also even the staff turnover isn't fast. Like the staff at Dior, some of them have been there 40 years.
Well, there's that amazing bit in it where she says we work for Mr. Dior. Like she's very respectful to Raf Simons, but that idea that they've been there for that long, and I think
that's what you buy into when you buy those garments. You wait, but you buy into all of that.
Yeah,
and that's really precious.
It is. I think it was very clever. I think the film's reach was very interesting as well, because it was just like a brilliant documentary, and I feel like documentary film is having a massive moment. Like you're seeing it even just like with the Amy Winehouse documentary that just came out, the same team that did Senna. I feel like people are interested in that kind of thing, and I wonder, it'd be interesting to see viewer figures for this, how many people who did go who weren't particularly interested in fashion, because I thought it would have just made you. It was so against that notion that fashion is kind of frivolous and throwaway. It really celebrated the craft and those amazing women.
I think that it is unusual in terms of really for such a huge brand to reveal its process on camera. And
it was very intimate, wasn't it? I was surprised how intimate it was.
But then I think, as you were saying, sometimes fashion can be quite backwards in terms of how it presents itself. And actually revealing that it is a craft and people are working really hard behind the scenes to make these beautiful dresses. That is, I think, quite new for big brands today. I mean, we just had London Craft Week in May this year, and Savile Row and the tailors were opening up their shops and showing people how to make, or how they make their clothes and their bags. And I think there really is a resurgence of interest in the public in making. The houses used to reveal how their dresses were made by, you could go and buy you still can, the Vogue patterns, and that died out. And I wonder if, as Lee Adercourt was talking about in her manifesto about the death of fashion, whether there will be this resurgence of maybe we will be able to download a Dior pattern, or there'll be this dressmaking again.
Well, you can download patterns on Show Studio. We have a series. It's amazing. It's very cool. It's a little plug. It's so good though. It's called Design Download, and we get designers to give us their patterns. And it's really good. There's like a Galliano pirate jacket. There's a Junior dress.
I wish I could sew.
It's really good. We just did one with J.W. Anderson. He gave us the bubble skirt. It's really great, and people can download them.
Fantastic.
And then they send them in and show us what they made, and it's very, very cool.
You see, this was commonplace.
Yeah, in the 50s, that's exactly what happened. Yeah. All those women's magazines were full of patterns, weren't they?
Yes, exactly. And it was all revealed in those pages.
Who's got time to make? I mean, that just makes me feel a little bit exhausted. I mean, I do love the idea that the patterns are there, but I took my boys and they were quite, I can't when the Chanel Couture documentary came out, which was another amazing insight into an atelier, and I think my boys were maybe 12 and 10 at the time, and really not fashion fans. I mean, they were into Scalextrics and dinosaurs, I think, at the time, and they sat and watched the entire thing. There's something very seductive about that human element, and then there's just something mesmerizing about the ability of a human being to start with nothing and make something incredibly beautiful. And that's, you know, when we went to see the Dior one, we watched it in quite a small cinema, but there were really not a lot of fashion people there. There were kind of local people of all ages, you know, men, women, and there was a great surge of emotion in that place coming out afterwards. And
But
some
you
people
even think about, it sounds really weird to relate the two, but you think about the success of things like Great British Bake Off and like Sewing Bee. I think there is this like enjoyment of watching people make stuff, but I also think, I think there's the making element to it, but I do also think when the September issue came out, which was much more kind of reality TV-esque, you know, it was much more about kind of like the clashes and the personalities and the egos, but I think that kind of created this, like we just live in that age of behind the scenes access, the reality TV generation, and I think people like to see these, that world and be able to be a little bit of a part of it.
How great to understand, because often fashion is ridiculed, saying £6,000 for that?
Yeah.
And of course that's a genuine and a normal and an acceptable reaction. But then when you have a chance to look at the petit main and the skills and the rarity and the, you know, anxiety and the passion that goes into the
and the fact that it could take weeks to embroider a sleeve.
Well, I thought that process where they were trying to develop that fabric, the Sterling Ruby one, where he wanted it to be really, really like actually kind of woven in, and I just thought that was amazing. You saw how nervous they were in the process, the back and forth.
I think the textiles designers are, you know, the unsung heroes of the fashion industry,
completely.
and I would have liked to have seen more about that process. You know, the manufacturers
you never know how they
working-
actually did it.
Yeah,
It's quite annoying.
just told that they worked all night. But.
Yeah, there's just one point I wanted to make about that, which I think that film kind of came as part of a wider policy within LVMH to really open up its kind of studios, because I think they're really trying to engage with the younger generation. And what we were talking about before of this relentless churn now, 4 seasons a year, or 6 if you're Dior, is that you really need to have talent on side, and you really need to pull in that younger generation of talent. And I think it slightly goes hand in hand, for example, with the award. They started a couple of years ago, and they did a series of trips where fashion students were coming in and looking at the Dior ateliers, and they were visiting it and really getting incredibly close access to Raf while he was working. And I think it all kind of came in at around the same time, where they were actually trying to open it up and show people the day-to-day workings and try and attract people to come and work in the industry.
And this would be great to get your expertise in this, because I think you also see it with the houses kind of setting up their own museums and stuff. Like I went to the Gucci Museum in Florence, and it was, well, it's very Gucci, it's very much like, you know, done by the brand, and they've kind of carefully skipped over a couple of difficult periods and that kind of thing. But it is really interesting to see that archive and have access to it, and it's incredibly educational. And it really was, there were a lot of, normal, non-fashion people in
Look at the
there.
McQueen exhibition at the VMA, for goodness sake. I mean, that is a blockbuster wherever it's been. And I've lost count of the number of non-fashion people who've told me how moved they were.
They just said they're going to keep it open 24
hours through the night.
Okay.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But do you think do you think that notion in craft is having a knock-on effect on exhibiting dress, because it's made people more interested in understanding?
I think that it's made the fashion exhibition become more of a spectacle. That I think a lot of audience expect the spectacle that is McQueen for the exhibition. I'm not sure. There are, you know, of course, it's a stunning exhibition, and there are moments for that. But
are we
it's
stuck in
not
a
all about
blockbuster
that.
mentality?
Well, I just wonder, it's about the different functions of the museum. You know, could you take that exhibition and put it in the O2 Arena, and would it lose its meaning? I mean, I don't know, but I suppose I feel always very strongly that you go to the museum to be moved emotionally, and actually that's exactly what the Aliquances under McQueen exhibition does. I think different exhibitions do different things, but actually the reason that we need people, you know, that we have to get people keep coming into the museums is because they get an experience they can't get elsewhere. And you certainly would never get the feeling you get in the Cabinet of Curiosities room in any retail environment. Or, I'm sure if you're a sports enthusiast, you would get that heightened kind of feeling.
And I'm thrilled about that, because I spent a lot of time, I don't know, talking to museum people and TV people also saying, fashion doesn't work on TV, fashion doesn't work in museums, nobody comes. And the the V&A was the Met Museum, the Met exhibition rather of McQueen was a game changer because it was a blockbuster. And of course, not every exhibition can be a blockbuster. One of the most emotional ones I ever went to was the Vionnet one in Paris in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, and that's maybe a bit more of an insider's day out.
Yeah.
But it was hugely emotional.
But there are historical precedents for that. I mean, in 1971, Zephyr Beaton organised a huge exhibition at the V&A, and using contemporary fashion and historical fashion, just before Diana Vreeland got her tenure at the Met. It was phenomenally popular. It took up the whole main entrance of the V&A, and what was surprising was it was so popular, but then there was a lull. But certainly since I got my job at the V&A in 1991, and it was at that sort of point that, you know, fashion was always the poor relation in the museum. If you're a fashion curator, you haven't got the academic gravitas as if you're a fine art or a sculpture curator. But by about 1997, all those museums that we never ever would have expected to exhibit fashion, like the Royal Academy exhibited Armani, the Imperial War Museum did the Utility Fashion exhibition, and it was the most popular exhibition it ever had. It extended its run. And then even museums devoted to fine art, like
Armani was quite controversial. We're getting into this.
But the National Gallery, when it did that exhibition, you know, usually you have exhibitions of genre or paint or period, but they brought paintings together because of drapery. And so yes, it's controversial in some ways, but it's actually also incredibly inclusive.
Because massively inclusive. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I just find that maybe the controversy or the potential for controversy lies in where the commercial, because it's all about how it's curated.
And it's also about when it's contemporary. If it's a contemporary monograph, it's clearly much more complicated because the commercial spin-offs are so immense. I mean, it gives you a cultural cachet that however many pages you pay for in the world's glossiest magazines, you're not going to get that.
I do think what's interesting is the knock-on effect. That I agree with you. I think this notion that I do think the McQueen exhibition was a game changer in exhibiting, but I think this notion that it set up the fashion exhibition as a thing is just really wrong. And you're seeing that argument kind of put out quite a lot. But I do think just the popularity of that has made people think differently. Like, I notice it. It's interesting that you mentioned retail, because I notice it in retail, the kind of this idea of using windows almost like pop-up galleries and getting archive clothes out and everything feels very, you know, we've talked about this before, we've joked about the popularity of the word curated, but it does feel like everything is getting much more curated and people are interested in that notion of creating this sense of, you know, whether it's an archive or, you know, things being displayed almost like you're in a museum.
But that's a fashion in its own right as well, isn't it? So we're at a point in fashion, you know, there's fashion in exhibitions and academia in the same way there's fashions in terms of clothing designs, and right now the aesthetic of, you know, the Cabinet of Curiosities, all those museum historical references, and the archive and designers, you know, marketing themselves on having heritage. That's why they're investing. I mean, there are certain companies that always did, like Saint Laurent, like Chanel, but other houses are. Some houses have it, like Burberry, and if they don't have it, they're trying to construct it, because that's a trend in itself. You know, in the 60s, when we had, you know, really futuristic fashion, none of those houses were interested. And if fashion shifts again, it might not be fashionable. But right now it is.
Yeah.
I think also to use the word curated in the fashion context kind of is a really strong counterbalance to what we were talking about earlier, which is the fact that things become increasingly disposable, because it's giving it that idea of, you know, precious, you know, eternal value. The idea of something that endures, the idea that it's got, you know, ongoing value, as opposed to the fact that, you know, in 3 months' time it's going to be slashed to 70% and you're going to be desperate to get it out of the shop.
But in 3 months' time the V&A exhibition will be coming down. I mean, they are, you know, they're not, it's the archives that are the permanent, you know, home.
And also museums don't only really, do they have to show the rare and precious?
Yeah.
And often what isn't rare and precious is actually what's hardest to survive, because I was talking with my son, we were looking at Nick Knight's early skinhead photos, and I was talking about curating the street style exhibition, and we were saying about how it's much, much harder to find those sorts of clothes now, even though they were worn in much huger quantities, than it ever would be to, say, find a particular Dior dress from 1953. Because, you know, they survive in rich people's houses and museums and the company. So,
but kind of those normal,
you know, museums can also show, you know, that which is disposable.
Yeah, there's the best article I ever read, and I'm obsessed with it. I reread it about once every like 3 months, and it's my dream job. Where it's, you probably know who it is. It's a piece in the New Yorker, and it was about the person at the V&A that has the job of collecting the items that reflect contemporary culture. And they wrote the piece where they bought. Do you remember when like Tesco's and those awful supermarkets were putting spikes outside so homeless people couldn't sleep?
It's unpleasant design.
And they bought those spikes as kind of a record, and they detailed like the other 7 things that they'd bought that year or something. And I got really obsessed. It was like they have to buy a selfie stick, and like I got very excited. But I thought that was really interesting about kind of like actual real life fashion.
Yeah, but there's all those wonderful museums that are devoted to completely bizarre collections.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think they're the ones that are often the most thrilling anyway. But you've got obsessive collectors collecting particular types of packaging or just, what is seemingly bizarre.
But that example you were given, I think it's Corinna Gardner at the V&A who was looking at their design collection policy, and I think that's really interesting in terms of design and architecture, the things that they're collecting, and how it's the curators that have the control over what is collected and what is remembered from a particular moment. And I think it's interesting that this debate is opened up to the wider public about what is being collected and what's the policy at the moment for the V&A's fashion collection.
Has there ever been an exhibition like that where it has been kind of curated by the public, where it's been about sort of the history of something?
There's been lots of exhibitions. They were called things like the People's Show, and you would get people to bring in their collections. So people who are obsessive Barbie doll collectors, obsessive particular sort of ring can opener obsessives, and they would come and put their collections in the museum.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But I wonder because it's interesting to have one which was not necessarily about people's collections, but more about what people felt was important or representative of the times, because it is interesting to think a curator's idea of what represented, 60s dressing or punk dressing.
Oh, absolutely. But certainly the social history museums will have done all sorts of things, like lots of oral testimony with people. And so you'll get a much more contemporaneous voice. So at the Imperial War Museum, for instance, you can go and hear women talking about what they wore, what they felt in the 1940s. And obviously it's with hindsight, but it's much better than us trying to imagine.
That's one thing that I felt was slightly lacking with the McQueen exhibition. I actually perhaps don't think it would have been relevant in the context of the exhibition, and we tried to sort of talk about it on Show Studio a bit, which was how the public were reacting to him and how the fashion press were reacting to him at the time, because it's all well and good looking at him now and saying, oh, he's amazing, but actually at the time there was so much negativity that surrounded a lot of his work, and I thought it was interesting to think about that
and how we revere people.
Yeah, of course.
Once they've died.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it was really weird being there with journalists who, like, I know wrote really awful stuff about him at the time, and everyone's like, oh my god, he's so amazing. And that's interesting as well. I think
a lot of that was edited out of the exhibition.
Yeah, I think it was.
And I think that museums are a place of education, and I think that that's one thing that we need to be careful of in terms of curating exhibitions in a public institution like the V&A.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to have a whole case that's devoted to all the designs that all the journalists completely slated.
Yeah, exactly. The ones they hated, and what they said.
A lot of creators are hated in their moment, aren't they? Look how much architecture is slagged off when it's built, and then 50 years hence it's a classic and it's listed. I mean, I think that's just normal.
Yeah. Should we look? I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious. Should we have a look at the Dior show? While we go through, the third topic that I wanted to talk about was what we're seeing. I think the stream might be a little bit jittery, but we'll do our best. Have they put up the footage yet? No. Okay. I'd like to talk as we kind of wait for the show to start about Raf Simons and what he's done there and what we feel, because he's been there for a while now. He's appointed in April 2012. So what do we think his stamp on the house has been?
Thank you.
Stunned into silence. I think. Yeah, go ahead.
I think he's. I'm a real supporter of him. I've been a huge fan of his work, but I particularly enjoy what he's doing at Dior. I think there's a real respect for the history of the house, but really bringing it into the present day is sort of still feminine, but this idea of modernity and really working with the textiles. I think his innovation, as well as his combining that with the respect for history, he does it with such a light touch.
Yeah. And I think the way he analyses what modernity is really interesting.
Yeah.
He's like obsessed with about time, and he's kind of talked about that. We've got the show notes, so just for the sake of our viewers, he's talked about this idea of and it's always about contrasting. So he talks about innocence versus experience, simplicity and luxury, and it kind of, the themes that he often looks at, this idea of history versus modernity, and he's talks about this idea of forbidden fruit and what that meant now. And I think that's really interesting when you think about things like femininity and sensuality, and they're words that we always talk about in relation to couture, but actually to think about what that does mean now. It's really interesting. I always feel like he's very, just that first dress with that kind of cutout at the back, and thinking about the way couture kind of objectifies in some ways, but also does. I think it's just very interesting.
Yeah, and what couture means now. I mean,
Yeah.
and what do those women who will spend that kind of money and wait that amount of time and attend all those appointments and to, to be fitted, what it is that they need and what events they're attending, and what function does it fulfill in their...
But also because it's haute couture, isn't it? It's not even couture. I mean, it's haute couture, which is only allowed to be used by certain houses that have been, vindicated by the Chambre Syndicale. It really, it's. I mean, it really is the pinnacle.
I think one thing that fascinates him is this kind of tension between incredible control and disorder.
Yeah.
And I think that was, you were talking about that silk that I think Bucol did that was based on the Sterling Ruby spray painting.
Yeah.
And I think his fascination with Sterling Ruby is very much due to the fact that it's very destructive and messy and this eruption of revoltingness.
Yeah.
And it's very much against, I guess, some of what I think are his quite strong instincts to make things very beautiful and perfect, and
which is
also
why I
very
think
much
he often got called minimal, because of that kind of focus on control.
But then he's obviously always had that fascination with kind of street culture and the way that people destroy their own clothes. And I think then how do you apply that to couture? I think it brings a really interesting tension to what he does.
No, definitely. I think tension's a good word for him, but I do find what he does, I think it's completely set a new bar in couture, and I think that's interesting. I think you see the sensibility that he's created there. I think you do see it filtered down, and it's interesting to say this as this dress comes along, because I find really interesting how he references kind of almost like historical costume and makes it feel so modern, and I think that's not something that, it's quite a Galliano-y thing to do. I mean, when he first did it with those frock coats, and everyone said, oh, he must be referencing the Galliano stuff, and I think he obviously was in a way, but I also think that's such a huge part of the history of couture, and it's really interesting to see that reference.
I think the silhouettes look a lot easier than the Galliano silhouette. Sorry, I wasn't trying to be kind of enigmatic by not saying anything. I was just dying to see how the show and let it kind of. But this is absolutely exquisite.
It still feels like a big departure.
He got landed into a situation that to me must have been hell.
It must, because he had so many legacies, didn't he?
I wouldn't have had the maturity to deal with it, and that was one of the most painful things I found watching that documentary. And maybe it's because I'm a mother, but my heart was breaking with the stress that he was under. And it's one particular PR, I think, in that movie that I just wanted to take by the shoulders and shake, because he seemed to be so cold in the face of his incredible anxiety and how well he was dealing with it. And I think it's taken him a couple of seasons to get his feet underneath him and really define what is the Raf Simons Dior. But to me, this looks like something way more rounded out and much more fulfilling of the potential that everybody knows that he's got, that I've seen to date. I mean, this looks kind of extraordinary.
The chest pieces, the metal chest pieces are quite amazing.
But he's talked about even the references that he's talking. He said the famous Dior manteaux show their similarities to the mantles of the late Middle Ages and the gowns of the Belle Epoque. And I think that's really interesting, is how he just pulls together these kind of all these different references. And I think what I love about it is you look at it and you see the joy of someone who loves designing when they've got access to amazing craftsmanship. And you don't often feel that at couture. You feel like it's added on, whereas you look at him and it feels like kind of like, that kind of sweet shop thing of like all these things that he can now do that will probably. And I think it's created this amazing tension between his own line. I was just at his men's show, and I love seeing it, just like you see it in that kind of scarf, the pieces that would cross between the two, and then the things that have become so different. And it's often in the subtle things like the 5 buttons, or in the show that he just did, it was all about kind of kids nightclubbing, and it was so removed and so different, and it's kind of this amazing conversation that's going on between the two, and it doesn't feel like a struggle in any way.
Yeah, I think the silhouettes are really beautiful, but it's the materiality that completely transforms. It sort of, that's what takes you somewhere else, isn't it? The layering and the palette and but also the variety of workmanship.
He also looks like a man who really likes women, which is a real breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
But also when he's referencing history, it doesn't become costume
No.
pastiche,
No,
which
not at
so
all.
often can happen, and it verges on the ridiculous. This is just completely elegant.
He's talked a lot in the show notes also, and it's interesting to talk about what couture means today, and he's talked about kind of the linings being as interesting and as intricate and as beautiful as the outside, so it's almost like it is an experience for the wearer. And it's interesting what you just said about him sort of liking women, because I think that's interesting as well, as that notion of comfort. And he talks about that in the Dior and I documentary. I love that moment where he's getting quite angry about the heels, and he's like, I hate it when they need to be walked up the stairs, and he doesn't want the models to have to be kind of supported. And it's obvious that it's just that notion of actually, if you buy couture, then you should enjoy it as much as someone looking at you in it. It's not like you're making.
It's about
yourself.
a real elegance, isn't it? And it is about an experience. And historically, you know, designers always said it's, you know, you step into the dress, you don't need underwear. And it when you look at historical dress in museums, I mean, it's looking at the stitching around the boning and all the things that, you know, the client saw, and maybe the person who helped the client dress. But that is the absolute beauty as well, because it's not just about show, which you can get cheap clothes that are less showy and fine, but it is, and it's all the little loops that hold things, and the tapes, and just that make that dress sit so perfectly.
I mean, look, I mean, this is, you could just imagine also somebody, you know, taking that off and just chucking it into a suitcase. God forbid that they would ever do such a sacrilegious thing. But
there is like an ease
there's
to it.
a very easy, I mean, look at that. It's really exquisite, and at the same time you can see the work in it as well.
Yeah, but, and also to get that really deep neckline sitting on the body without moving,
Exactly.
that is a real
Exactly.
skill, isn't it?
It is interesting, that notion of how clothes are made, because we talked about that a bit on the panel that we did earlier today, which is how our expectations of our clothes have changed. And I think people, that's why everyone likes things like stretch, is that actually that notion of things being properly fitted, actually to some people that feels quite alien, to have something where it isn't you just pull it over your head and it stretches to fit your body. And it's interesting, I think that's what's so great about things like Dior and I, and also kind of an interest in his work, is hopefully it does make people kind of expect more from their clothes in some way, rather than just expecting it to kind of like vaguely fit and stretch around you.
Because it's not only how you look, is it? It's how it makes you feel and how you conduct yourself. And you see that with children when they dress up, don't they? I mean, the whole persona changes when they put a heavy garment on, but it does that to us as well. And it is transformative.
This is so beautiful, but I do feel it's different to what he's done before. I think there are some elements where I know I'm surprised by the kind of, he's done so much tailoring in the past, you know, such a focus on things like the suiting, or this is so much about the dresses and really, really flowy, and it's much less structured than a lot of what we've seen from him.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you were talking about the link to menswear, and I think in a funny kind of way, you know, he had all of those kind of northern soul silhouettes inspired by Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore, and that, you know, that with these the extraordinary trousers that were just kind of like melting onto the floor, and in a funny kind of way there is an alliance between the two, with the slim tops and this kind of long flow.
But also this is incredibly well thought through as well, because it looks like he's considered every potential aspect of a modern customer's needs. I need to go back to the commercial the whole time, but you know, those coats are amazing, the cocktail dresses are amazing, the trousers look amazing. I mean, he really, it's a very customer friendly.
It's coherent as a collection.
Really
isn't
coherent.
it?
Yeah. Much better, much more articulate than me.
But it does feel like a proposition of a wardrobe, which is interesting because, and Alex Fury's actually doing a thing on our Tumblr at the moment about the women who actually buy couture, and I think it is, we kind of other them in our heads, but also they do have like actual lives as well, and they might be very glamorous ones, but you do, the notion of actually if you're going to buy a couture dress, you probably do want also couture day wear, and maybe that is much more elevated, not going to be like jeans and a t-shirt, but I think the fact that he's kind of offering something to all those elements of a woman's life just feels, it makes couture feel more modern, because it stops that notion that it is just kind of like prom dresses and wedding dresses.
And he's obviously styled it in a very interesting way, so it feels very virginal and pure, and there's a slight fuzz to the hair and the lack of makeup, and so it, you know, as you were saying, it does feel like they did just kind of sling the dress on, and it just happened to immaculately curve every tiny undulation of the body.
It's not really an accident.
But that is also what's interesting thinking about that parallel with his own line, is his obsession with youth, and I think it's really interesting how in his menswear it's often about youth culture, you know, youth tribes, youth gangs, and you know, Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore is a really good example of that. But I think his work at Dior, it's obsessed with youth in a very different way, and it kind of comes through in the show notes. He talks about, you know, forbidden fruit and innocence and purity, and I think it's the similar obsession with youth, but it's about like that kind of untangible, that inaccessible thing. It's like the ultimate luxury, isn't it? Being young and slender. It's something that no much money can buy, and I think it is just another of his obsessions manifesting in a different way. I think it's not youth culture, but it is still youth, and what makes that interesting. And
it's funny because, you know, he's been doing these walls of flowers for years, and we're kind of not seeing that in the same way, but I'm almost thinking of those women on the medieval tapestries against the background of that entire wall of flowers, and that suddenly, and it suddenly kind of feels that, you know, with this amazing embroidery, that's kind of, it feels like those kinds of shapes.
And I mean, if you go back to the youth thing, because I've actually had the opportunity once to sit in a couture showroom and watch the sales happen.
Oh, amazing.
Which was really amazing.
Yeah, that would be the dream.
Because also the kind of people who were shopping were a really, really eclectic mix, from kind of wedding parties from Saudi Arabia with everybody from grandmother to daughter shopping, to kind of, you know, clearly quite wealthy but not obviously wealthy American ladies looking for kind of trophy pieces. Youth was not the prevailing quality. It wasn't. It was not like a kind of youth fest. But that to me looks very ageless. I mean, there's sleeves on, you know, which we all kind of love at a certain point.
But that's what's interesting, I think,
easy.
Is how he takes. It's not like he just makes clothes for young women. It's how he takes. Like, it's like ideas of youth. That's what I'm obsessed with. What he does, and it's like almost like it's as if he's like doing an ode to Picasso. He's doing an ode to.
He takes the stuffing out of it.
And it's about the idea of
it's
what
not
that
so
means.
formal. Yeah. Oh, I feel like I want to clap.
I know, he's so sweet. Can we look at some pictures of it? We got them in because it's nice to kind of just go, particularly because it was so. Because I think it's interesting that he talks about purity in the show notes, you know, purity and innocence, and he said no longer a flower garden but a sexual one, and there is something kind of, I think there is something quite sort of about the kind of the sensuality of youth that he's captured in that collection that's quite interesting. You know?
Yeah, they're kind of alluring, aren't they? More than overtly sexual in a way, but that's much more elegant.
Well, it's interesting, especially because last season he has been doing stuff quite recent that is quite sexual, like the PVC, like those like sort of latex boots and like the real patterns in the cat suits, whereas this is much more kind of inviting. And
it's also this idea of sexual has to be about showing everything, and this is completely, it's hiding and
and enveloping and wrapping.
Hard to know what Kim Kardashian will buy from that, isn't it?
Does she ever wear Dior? I've never seen her in Dior. I don't know. Maybe
She'd buy that belted black number in a shop.
Would she?
Yeah, I reckon.
But when those looks came out,
my favourite game.
That's what I was most surprised about. It's when that run started coming, because that does look completely different to I think stuff we've seen from him before. Like that's very almost like. It is almost like, for want of a better kind of phrase, like Galliano Dior, you know, it's very kind of costumey, it's very fantasy, you imagine a story, like, you know, she's running in a forest, her knight in shining armour's over there, you know, it doesn't feel as Raf Simons.
It's ecclesiastical a bit as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But they also mentioned in the show notes that the jewellery was becoming more important, and it's quite interesting, there are these kind of almost like chatelaine kind of chains coming, but off the wrong part of the body, but he's gone kind of maximalist on the jewellery, and it's real body armour. Where so it stopped being the kind of innocent virgin, and it becomes quite more kind of the warrior queen kind of thing.
But then there's still echoes of that Dior classic new look silhouette there as well. I mean,
that black belted dress is
the waist and the skirt and
But it's interesting, isn't it, how cluttered this could have felt. Like if you read the show notes before you saw it, that kind of mashup of histories. He's like late Gothic via the Renaissance and the Baroque. Recent masters of 19th, 20th century, it's like the broad sweep of history, and you kind of read that and you're like, whoa, where's this going to go? And then it feels so kind of clean and edited, and I think that's what he's really good at, like picking and choosing. And
I'm so relieved by that though, because if I see another kind of 1980s show, I think I'm going to hurl.
But it's the mannequins' gestures as well that they go very well with the clothes. The way they move is very, there's a sort of humility and elegance, isn't there, that's quiet.
Yeah.
And it's all about the textiles as well. I mean,
And those beautiful colours.
yeah.
The purple's quite ecclesiastical, isn't it, as well? Was it you that mentioned it being quite
Yeah. The colours are interesting though, because I think you've come to associate him with kind of quite sharp colours and quite neons, and I think it's interesting the way he's moved that into these more kind of, and we've seen it in the last season as well, these kind of painterly, quite strange tones, like, you know, like the rich kind of burgundies that again kind of relate to costume, whereas I always thought of him with quite artificial colours, you know, things like those real kind of bright yellows that he did for a while and the weird kind of neons.
He said that he had a kind of obsession with things like deep sea diving, where you look really closely at anemones going right into a flower. So you look at a flower and it looks like it's a very gentle colour, and then you look right in and right in and right in. It's got those kind of hot neons. So I think the idea was that he was almost looking for those artificial tones in nature that kind of people overlooked.
So how do we think, because you seem to imply, Paula, at the start as well, that you think his aesthetic has developed and changed a lot since he's been there. How would we kind of define his trajectory, and where does this suggest that is it too simplistic to say that this suggests he's moving in a certain direction? What would we say his vision for Dior is?
God, it feels to me like somebody with a hyper-sensitive approach, and you know that was really clear in the documentary, I thought. I mean, he's really he internalises a lot. And then at the same time, this emotion that's kind of bubbling under, it just seems he's really dug deep into the whole kind of history and aesthetic of Dior. At the same time, kind of wrestling with the idea of what his modern customer wants and really trying to serve her, which is such a incredible thing to feel coming from a designer, since so many of them now are kind of superstars in their own right and almost expect their customers to follow them, rather than he really seems to have her up front and centre. And the other thing which is super interesting is the way he's affected by the zeitgeist. I mean, this is not a comfortable world that we're living in. And you can see that kind of, you know, the gentleness and the kind of slightly submissive, but it's not...
That's amazing, 20, talking about submissive, it's like we were talking about innocence and like it's so sensual, number 20.
I mean, I use that word really advisedly, because I don't mean submissive in the sense of being kind of a victim. I just mean a kind of, it just reflects a kind of fragility.
And a foreboding almost.
And a worry and an anxiety. But so, I can kind of see all of that coming through there, and it's just fabulous to see a designer of his stature flower.
I think it's interesting
in his place. It's really cool.
Yeah, his process is interesting. When you talk about kind of the way you described it, then does give that sense of kind of him drawing on so many different things. And I think the process of how he designs is really interesting. And I think that's one thing that also that documentary is great at showing is, you know, he doesn't sketch and he does come up with these themes, and then all the people working within Dior kind of come back and propose their own versions. And he says in it, there's that nice moment where he's like, you know, everyone's got a chance to get something in. And that's interesting because you think, well, of course it is going to be more rounded because it's not really a singular vision. And I think it's interesting that he has such a precise view and obviously such a clear viewpoint, but also that his collections are fed by the ideas of all those different people, kind of suggesting things that relate to his themes.
But that makes total sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you consider what a designer's output has to be now.
Yeah.
So he's got to be the conductor of an orchestra of virtuoso players, in a way. It's the only way that...
What's
it's only a
refreshing
certain
is
sort of
that
person.
he says it.
Yeah, he says it.
Yeah.
And how he was warm to the staff, and
Yeah.
you kind of feel you'd like him,
Yeah.
as well as liking his clothes.
So we're impressed then. It seems like we're very...
It's a hit.
It is a hit. There's lots to look at, which I like. There's lots to kind of, you want to trace the history of all the pieces and try and find all the references, and that's...
Well, I want to touch everything. A little bit frustrating looking at it through a screen, because I'm sure there's lots more kind of...
We can't see the texture.
So much so we can't see the important stuff, all of the embroidery and the...
No, it's really, really beautiful.
And the casting is fabulous.
I like the custom embroidery. I just think everyone is white. It's like I find it really, really hard to look at collections where they look really modern. I keep bashing on about this at the moment, but like this is all about modernity, and then everyone is white, and it's just I just find that so weird. Like especially for a house that is traveling the world doing all these different shows, I just find that really difficult. But the girls are beautiful, but yeah.
That coat particularly amazing.
Yeah, really beautiful. So we're impressed. We think this will do well. We're all like picking and choosing from it already.
Yeah, exactly.
Number 35 model there isn't white.
Yeah, number
that's
35.
good.
Yeah.
So should we give
A
him...
little fantasy shopping list.
I know. Yeah, it's very impressive. It is a beautiful show. Should we give them a round of applause to wrap
Yes,
things
for
up?